Around 1200 BC, the most advanced, interconnected civilizations on Earth burned to the ground. Within a single human lifetime, sprawling networks of trade and diplomacy simply vanished. Empires like the Mycenaeans in Greece and the Hittite Empire in Anatolia controlled vast territories. They operated out of heavily fortified capitals, projecting a kind of permanent, immovable power that seemed impossible to break. The destruction of these superpowers is traditionally blamed on a mysterious coalition of maritime marauders known as the Sea Peoples. According to surviving Egyptian records, these warriors in distinct horned helmets swept the Mediterranean, capsizing ships, sacking coastal capitals, and violently disrupting the supply chains that kept the Bronze Age running. For decades, historians looked at the ashes of these great palaces and concluded that human progress had collapsed into a terrifying, centuries-long void. But a surviving papyrus tells a different story. It follows an Egyptian official named Wenamun, who traveled up the coast of the Levant shortly after this collapse. Wenamun's trip was a disaster. He was robbed by his crew, stranded, and openly mocked. Local kings in coastal cities, rulers who previously would have bowed to an envoy of the pharaoh, made him wait for weeks, completely ignoring his demands. The days of imperial reverence were over. Egypt had lost its monopoly on trade and power in the region, and these local coastal cities were now operating completely independently, which forces us to look at the ashes of 1200 BC differently. The burning of these massive, top-heavy empires was likely a desperately needed, forceful systemic upgrade. The old empires ran on what historians call palace economies. This was a strictly top-down system where a central democracy controlled all the major trade, hoarded the resources, and managed the distribution. When those palaces burned, that entire rigid structure evaporated overnight, leaving a massive economic vacuum across the Mediterranean. Almost immediately, new entrepreneurs stepped into the void. Canaanites, early Phoenicians, and newly settled groups like the Philistines began building independent coastal markets. The logistics of global trade physically shrank. The massive, slow cargo ships funded by kings were replaced by smaller, agile vessels, making independent point-to-point runs along the coast. These independent merchants built a decentralized network of local markets. Because power was spread out rather than concentrated in a single throne room, this new system was highly resilient and far harder to destroy. This economic shift was driven by a technological one. Bronze is an inherently elitist material. It requires combining copper with tin, and tin is rare. Making bronze required vast, secure, and highly expensive long-distance supply chains that only an empire could afford to protect. When those imperial supply chains snapped, island societies like Cyprus didn't die out. Cut off from imported tin, local metalworkers innovated out of pure necessity. We can see this transition in the archaeological record with this 12th century knife from Nkomi. It captures the ingenuity of a society adapting on the fly. The smith forged the iron blade, but attached it to the handle using traditional bronze rivets. Iron ore is found almost everywhere. You didn't need the wealth of a pharaoh to mine it or forge it. By switching to iron, these communities permanently decentralized military and economic power, placing the ability to make tools and weapons into the hands of local merchants and farmers. While empires were falling apart on land, another massive leap was happening quietly on the water. Shipbuilders developed the brailed sail. By using a system of ropes to quickly gather and alter the canvas, sailors could suddenly catch crosswinds and navigate far more complex routes. They also began building symmetrical, double-prowed hulls. These ships were highly maneuverable and easily beached on shallow shorelines to trade directly with coastal towns. These agile ships empowered a new, chaotic mix of independent merchants, migrants, and pirates, a group historians sometimes call the proletariat of the sea. Operating completely outside of royal control, these sailors established a wild, highly competitive maritime market. They ended up connecting the Mediterranean basin far more deeply and efficiently than the rigid, heavily guarded fleets of the old kings ever did. The 12th and 11th centuries BC were defined by an explosion of highly adaptable entrepreneurial energy. It is exactly like a biological extinction event. The oversized, rigid imperial dinosaurs had to clear out so that a diverse, fast-moving ecosystem of mammals could finally thrive. This decentralized, competitive environment forced constant innovation. It directly drove the alphabet's refinement, the spread of advanced iron metallurgy, and the framework for independent city-states. The absolute destruction of the Bronze Age monopolies was a strict prerequisite for everything that followed. Without it, the eventual rise of classical Greece and Rome would have been impossible. It challenges us to rethink what a systemic collapse actually looks like in the grand sweep of human history. History's greatest collapses are rarely the end of the world. They are usually the messy, chaotic birth of a far more resilient future.